When Steve Harvey stepped onto his set that day, he thought it would be just another episode, laughter, transformation stories, and a few heartfelt moments. What he didn't expect was a surprise message from a Hollywood legend. That's when Clint Eastwood appeared on the screen, delivering a tribute no one saw coming. What started as a normal taping turned into one of the most emotional moments of Steve's career. Because in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't just offer praise, he delivered a quiet, powerful lesson about legacy, manhood, and the impact of being seen. And what happened next brought the entire studio to its feet. The lights were warm, the audience was loud, and Steve Harvey, well, he was in his element, standing center stage in a tailored navy suit, pocket square, just loud enough to be Steve Harvey approved. He grinned that trademark grin and pointed a finger toward someone in the front row. "Don't be acting shy now, you came here to laugh," he hollered, the audience erupting again. He turned back to the camera, walking the floor like a preacher on Sunday morning. "That's what we do here," he said. "We laugh, we heal, we keep it real." It was the third segment of the day, a feel-good transformation story. A woman named Dana had just come out for her reveal. New hair, new dress, new confidence. The crowd clapped, some folks even stood, and Steve gave her a proud nod. "You ain't walking, you glidin'. Girl, you better go ahead." The whole room was eating out of the palm of his hand. The rhythm of the show was smooth. Steve joked, encouraged, hit his cues like clockwork. Even in his 60s, he still had the stamina of a man half his age, strutting across the stage like the boss he was. Backstage, producers watched the monitors with half smiles. Another good day. The show was humming. From the outside, nothing looked different. No one in the audience would have guessed anything unusual was coming. Not the woman in the second row fanning herself with a cue card. Not the security guard near the stage who'd heard 1,000 shows just like this one. And certainly not Steve, because in Steve's world, this was the routine. Make people laugh, make them feel seen, make them feel better than when they walked in. He pointed to a man in the back with tears in his eyes. "Now hold up. Don't be crying on national television. You ain't gonna have me messing up this makeup today." The crowd lost it. Another perfect moment. Another Steve Harvey classic. The cameras rolled. The lights stayed hot. And somewhere behind the curtain, a quiet plan was already in motion. Because what Steve didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this day wasn't going to end like any other. Not today. Not with what was coming next. They cut to commercial. The music faded. The studio lights dimmed just slightly, giving everyone a chance to breathe. Steve pulled a towel from the side table and dabbed his forehead like he always did during breaks. "Y'all trying to roast me alive with these lights?" he muttered, laughing to himself. He turned to head back toward his dressing room when two producers intercepted him halfway to the curtain. One of them, a younger guy in a headset named Tyrell, stepped forward. "Steve, hey, we got something a little special for the next segment." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Special how?" Tyrell hesitated for just a beat too long. "It's a surprise. We just need you to stay on stage for it." Now Steve had been in the game long enough to know when producers were up to something. He narrowed his eyes, shook his head slowly. "Don't be bringing out no clowns, Tyrell. I ain't got the reflexes for all that today." The older producer beside him, Janice, gave a soft chuckle and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Nothing crazy, Steve, just something we think you'll appreciate." That didn't exactly calm his nerves, because when producers say, "you'll appreciate it," what they really mean is, you might cry or punch somebody or both. Still, Steve nodded, gave a long, dramatic sigh. "Aight, but if y'all got my mama walking out here, I'm gonna need a moment." Back on set, the stage crew moved quietly, quickly. They brought out a chair, just one, positioned dead center under the spotlight. Steve looked at it, then looked at Janice. "What's with the lonely chair?" She smiled. "You'll see." Steve glanced up toward the control booth. Someone gave him a thumbs up. Tyrell's voice echoed in his earpiece. "Ready when you are, Steve?" The stage lights warmed again. The audience began to murmur, sensing something different. Steve straightened his tie, took a breath. Showtime again. But even as he flashed that signature grin to the crowd, even as the cameras went live again and the applause sign lit up, he couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Something was different. And for once, Steve Harvey didn't have a clue what was about to happen next. The cameras rolled back in. The audience clapped on cue. Steve Harvey stood under the spotlight, hands folded in front of him, eyebrows raised just enough to say, "What y'all got cooking?" He looked around, smirking. "So, we just gonna act like that chair don't look suspicious?" A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, but the production crew didn't flinch. The house lights dimmed a little further, and the giant screen behind Steve flickered to life. He turned to face it, squinting slightly as a soft instrumental cue played from the speakers. Tyrell's voice buzzed in his earpiece. "Steve, we got a message from someone who's a big admirer of your work. Just watch." Steve chuckled. "If this is another church lady that cooked for me when I was broke, I'm finna lose it." The screen glitched for a second. Then came the opening frame, black and white. A rugged profile came into view. The crowd leaned forward. And then the voice hit. "I've seen a lot of people talk on television," the man said, his tone low, steady, unmistakable, "but not many who speak with heart." Steve blinked once, twice. The image sharpened. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, sitting in what looked like a quiet room lined with old books and dusty awards, wearing a denim shirt, sleeves rolled up, that familiar squint in his eye. The audience gasped. Someone in the front row whispered, "No way." Clint continued, unfazed. "Steve, I've watched your show quietly for a long time, laughed with you, thought with you, and every now and then, you made me stop and just listen." Steve didn't move, didn't blink. He looked like someone had hit pause on his soul. Clint leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "I'm not a man of many words, never have been. But I wanted to take a moment to say something to you because you remind me of something this world's been missing." The audience went silent. No clapping, no murmuring. Just that voice filling the room. And Steve? He was locked in, like he was seeing a ghost and a legend all at once. And in that moment, everyone knew. This wasn't just a surprise. This was something personal. Steve stood there like a man who just got hit with a memory he didn't know he had. He stared at the screen, mouth slightly open, one hand on his hip like he needed to brace himself. "Hold up, is that—" he finally managed, eyes narrowing. The crowd erupted, confirming what Steve's heart already knew. It was Clint Eastwood. The Steve Harvey Show had seen a lot of surprises, reunions, proposals, even surprise makeovers. But never this. Never Dirty Harry popping up in the middle of a Tuesday taping like it was no big deal. Steve looked toward the producers off stage, squinting like a man trying to catch someone in a lie. "Y'all playing with me," he said, pointing toward the control booth. "Is that CGI? Don't mess with my emotions now." But the screen kept playing. Clint was real, and his voice, steady, sincere, cut through Steve's disbelief. "Back in my day, we didn't have a whole lot of men like you on TV," Clint said. "Not ones who made people feel seen, heard, respected." Steve let out a breathy laugh, half joy, half nerves. "Oh, Lord," he muttered, fanning his face with one hand. "Not Clint Eastwood out here, saying my name like we friends." The audience cheered, laughing with him, some of them wiping away tears already. This wasn't just a cameo. This was a legend, tipping his hat to another. Steve turned to face the crowd, shaking his head slowly. "I done told y'all, don't surprise me with stuff like this. I'm trying to keep it together for daytime television." But even as he joked, you could see it. That little crack in his voice. The way his smile twitched like it was trying to hold back something deeper. Steve Harvey, comedian, host, mentor, the man who always had a comeback, for once didn't know what to say, and for the first time in a long time, he just listened. The screen held steady, no fancy transitions, no dramatic music, just a close-up of Clint Eastwood, older now, lines on his face like maps of a life well lived, eyes sharp as ever, his voice rolled out low and even, like gravel on a quiet road. "Steve," he said with a nod, "I've watched you for years." The audience was dead silent. Steve didn't blink, didn't move. His smile had faded into something softer, something almost childlike. He wasn't on anymore. He was just there, taking it in. Clint leaned forward slightly in his chair, elbows resting on denim-clad knees, hands clasped. "I don't do this kind of thing often," he continued. "In fact, I don't think I've ever sent in a video to a talk show. Ain't exactly my style." A few chuckles from the audience. Even Steve managed a breath of laughter, but it caught in his throat halfway. "But I wanted to say something to you, because you deserve to hear it while you're still here, doing what you do, not after, not in a tribute, but now, while the mic's still in your hand." The room changed. The air got thick. Steve's hand slowly moved from his waist to his chest, pressing flat just over his heart. He wasn't trying to be funny anymore. He was trying to stay grounded. Clint glanced off screen for a moment, gathering his words like they weighed something. "There's a lot of noise out there these days," he said. "A lot of people talking, not many listening. But when I watch you, I see a man who makes space for both." He paused, looked straight into the lens, straight at Steve. "That matters." And that was the thing about Clint Eastwood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't use a lot of words. But when he spoke, people leaned in. Because the man didn't waste time on flattery. He said what needed to be said, and only what needed to be said. Steve nodded slowly, lips pressed together. His eyes shimmered just slightly beneath the lights. "Keep doing what you're doing," Clint said. "Keep holding the line. Men like you don't come around too often." The screen lingered on Clint's face for one more beat. Then it cut to black. The screen faded back in, this time Clint sitting a little more relaxed now. But the weight of his words hadn't lifted. It was clear this wasn't just admiration. It was legacy talking to legacy. "You know, Steve," he said, voice still low, still steady, "you've got this thing about you, that rare thing. You make people laugh and you make them think. Both, at the same time." Steve let out a quiet exhale, almost a laugh, but not quite. His hand stayed at his heart. Clint smiled just slightly, the kind of smile that said, "I see you." "That ain't easy," he continued. "Comedy's a sharp blade. Some folks use it to cut people down, but not you. You use it to lift people up." There it was, the heart of the message. You've stood in rooms full of pain, full of fear, full of folks who forgot what hope sounded like. And somehow, you brought it back, with a joke, with a word, with that big old grin. Steve's jaw clenched for a moment. You could tell he was trying to stay present, trying not to get swept up in it. But it was already happening. Clint looked off to the side like he was remembering something specific. Then he nodded. "There was one episode," he said, "maybe 5-6 years ago. You brought this young man out. He'd just gotten out of prison. Whole world had turned its back on him. And you sat him down, looked him in the eye and said, 'You're not broken. You just need a second chance.'" The audience murmured softly. A few people remembered it. Clint nodded again. "You didn't make a show out of it. You didn't talk over him. You just gave him space. And I'll tell you what, watching that, I said to myself, that right there, that's what a man looks like." Steve covered his mouth with one hand. His eyes were glistening now. "That's leadership," Clint said. "Not just barking orders, not just looking good in a suit, but standing in the gap for somebody else, even when you don't have to." The screen stayed on Clint for a moment longer. Then he said it quiet and clear. "You're the real deal, Steve. Don't let anybody tell you different." The video kept rolling, no flashy cuts, no dramatic music, just Clint, sitting in that simple chair, talking like he was across the table from an old friend. "You know, Steve," he said, voice steady as ever, "we come from two different places, different coasts, different times. But there's something about your story that always felt familiar to me." Steve stood off to the side now, away from the spotlight, arms crossed tight against his chest. His eyes never left the screen. You could tell. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was personal. "I didn't grow up with much," Clint continued. "Didn't have a fancy name or a straight line to success. Everything I've got, I built with my own two hands, and I see that in you." The crowd stayed quiet, hanging on every word. "You didn't ride in on a silver spoon," Clint said. "You crawled, you hustled. You told jokes in places that didn't even want to laugh. You bombed and you got back up. You failed and you showed up again anyway." Steve nodded slowly. That part. He knew that part better than anyone. Clint leaned forward just a little, voice softening. "You remind me what it means to build something from grit, from scratch. Not because someone opened a door, but because you kicked one down." The room shifted. That line hit. You could feel it. "You've walked through this world with your head held high, not because it's been easy, but because you decided you wouldn't let the hard parts define you." Steve bit down gently on his lip, trying to hold it together. His signature mustache twitched at the corners, fighting a smile he didn't quite have the strength for. Clint exhaled through his nose, a quiet pause. "We need more men like that," he said. "More men who've been through the fire and came out stronger, not bitter." He looked into the camera again, clear and direct. "You ain't just funny, Steve. You're solid. You're real. And real? That don't go out of style." The screen held for a moment, Clint looking right through the lens like he'd been holding that in for years. And Steve? He was holding something too. Clint sat back slightly, the weight of what he was about to say already hanging in the air. His voice dropped to something quieter, more reflective. "You didn't know this," he began, "but I was watching that night." Steve tilted his head, eyebrows furrowing. He didn't know where this was going. Clint continued. "Few years ago, maybe more now, you brought a kid out on your show. Name's probably long gone from the headlines, but I remember him." The audience was still, some of them glancing toward Steve, waiting to see if he remembered too. He was scared, shoulders hunched like the world had already made up its mind about him, Clint said. He couldn't have been more than 22, got into trouble, bad crowd. The system nearly swallowed him up. Steve's eyes went wide, recognition slowly setting in. "I remember how you sat with him," Clint said. "Not across the room, not behind a desk, right next to him. You didn't preach, you didn't shame him, you just asked, 'What do you want your life to look like from here?'" A few people in the crowd nodded, some remembering, others just feeling the weight of it. Clint paused, shaking his head slightly, like the memory had never left him. "I've directed a lot of movies in my time," he said, "seen men pretend to be brave, to be broken, to be redeemed. But that moment, that wasn't acting, that was real, and it stuck with me." Steve turned his face slightly, blinking hard. One hand went to his jaw, like he was trying to hold himself together from the outside in. "You didn't make it about you," Clint added. "You made it about giving somebody a shot. You looked at a kid everyone had written off, and you said, 'You matter.'" The crowd was quiet again, some wiping tears, some holding breath. "That stuck with me more than most movies I've made," Clint said softly, "because it reminded me of something I'd started to forget, that sometimes the biggest difference we can make has nothing to do with cameras or awards, but everything to do with the moments nobody sees." Steve dropped his head, shoulders shaking just slightly. He wasn't hiding emotion, he was feeling every bit of it. And this time, the man used to making others cry was the one breaking. At first, Steve stood like he always did, shoulders back, chin up, hands resting at his sides. That familiar smile still tugging at his face, even as Clint's voice rolled out from the screen. But something in him was beginning to change. You could see it. Clint wasn't just talking anymore, he was cutting through the surface, reaching somewhere deeper. Steve shifted his weight, crossed his arms, uncrossed them, tried to laugh at a line Clint delivered, but the sound barely left his mouth. That smile. It faded, slow and steady, like a curtain being pulled closed. Clint's words kept coming, not sharp, not dramatic, but measured and full of weight. The kind of weight only earned through time, loss, reflection. "You made me remember," Clint had said just a moment earlier, "what it means to stand up for somebody when the world's sitting down." Steve looked out at the audience. A few folks were already tearing up, but mostly it was stillness, a rare kind of stillness. Like they all knew they were watching something bigger than a talk show moment. This wasn't TV anymore. This was real life, unguarded. And Steve, he wasn't the host anymore. He was just a man hearing something he never expected. His shoulders dropped a little. His eyes, usually so alert and ready to react, started to shimmer beneath the lights. Not blinking fast like he was trying to stop the tears, but slow, accepting. He brought a hand up to his mouth and held it there, his chest rising and falling a little faster now. The kind of breath that comes when something inside starts to crack, not from pain, but from truth. The cameras didn't cut away, they didn't need to, because the audience was already there with him, locked in, every soul in that room leaning forward like they were sitting on the edge of something sacred. And for Steve Harvey, who'd spent his whole life holding court with laughter and punchlines, this was the first time in a long time the only sound he had left was silence. The image of Clint Eastwood on the screen didn't shift much, but his tone did. The calm was still there, the strength too. But now there was something else woven into his voice, something thinner, vulnerability. "There were moments in my life," Clint began, "where I could have said more, done more, stood up when it counted." He looked down, hands clasped in front of him. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just honest. "I've seen injustice, I've seen pride take the wheel, I've seen men fall because no one told them they mattered before it was too late." Steve's brow furrowed gently. He didn't move, didn't speak, but every part of him was listening, deeply. Clint looked back up at the camera, and something about his gaze had changed. It wasn't just steady, it was heavy with something long carried. "I've been thinking about that more these days," he said. "Legacy, not the kind they etch into statues, but the kind that lives in the choices we make when nobody's clapping." He took a pause. Then he said it, quiet, clear, and without flinching. "You made me think about the kind of man I want to be, even now." Steve's hand went to his chest again, fingers pressing against the fabric of his jacket like he was trying to ground himself. He didn't try to stop the tears anymore. He just let them come. "You stand for folks who don't have a platform," Clint said. "You give them one. You walk into rooms full of doubt, and you still lead with love. I don't always agree with everything out there, but what you do, Steve, it ain't just hosting a show, it's changing people." The audience was still, some visibly crying, others with hands clasped like they were watching church unfold. Steve wiped at his eyes, shaking his head slowly. A man overwhelmed, but not embarrassed, just full. Completely full. Clint gave a small nod. "So this ain't just a thank you. It's an apology for the times I didn't speak up, for the chances I let pass. And it's a reminder to me, and maybe to some of the folks watching, that it's never too late to be the man you were supposed to be." And just like that, the weight in Steve's chest got a little heavier and a whole lot clearer. Clint leaned back in his chair, not with ease, but with that kind of quiet finality that comes when a man has said what needed saying. His voice, still low and steady, filled the studio one last time. "There's a lot of folks on TV," he said. "A lot of folks with microphones, followers, fans, but there's only a handful who use that spotlight to light someone else's path." He paused, the silence behind his words giving them weight. You're one of them, Steve." Steve closed his eyes for a moment, jaw tight. He looked like he was holding something heavy, maybe the years, maybe the truth, maybe both. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to be poetic. He just said it plain. "Thank you," he said, "for being a man worth watching." That was it. The screen lingered on Clint's face for just a breath. Those eyes that had stared down gunslingers, outlaws, and decades of Hollywood expectations, now soft with respect. Then, slowly, the screen faded to black. No music, no applause, just the room sitting in that silence like it was holding its breath. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was a moment, the kind that stays with people long after the lights dim. And for Steve Harvey, it landed like a whisper, straight to the soul. For a full 10 seconds, Steve didn't move. He just stood there, hands by his side, head tilted slightly, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock, but from being completely overcome. The audience didn't say a word. Then, slowly, Steve took in a breath. Deep, shaky. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He laughed, barely, just enough to let people know he was trying to hold it together. But the tremble in his chest said otherwise. His hand went to his face. A single tear slipped past his cheek and caught in his mustache. The audience saw it, and then, softly, respectfully, they began to applaud. No whistles, no whooping. Just palms coming together in the gentlest way. A standing ovation without the noise, just presence. Steve turned toward them, eyes glassy, voice finally cracking through the silence. I didn't know he saw me like that," he whispered. His voice broke again on the last word. "I didn't know." He looked down, shook his head slow, tried to laugh it off again, but the weight was too much this time. His lips tightened, and another tear rolled down. The crowd kept clapping, slowly, steadily. Some people wiped their own eyes. Steve finally looked up, took another breath. "You work your whole life. Try to do right. Try to make folks laugh. Show them some love. But you never think someone like Clint Eastwood's out there watching you. Not like that." He nodded, eyes red now, smile faint but true. "That's different," he said quietly. That hit different. And in that moment, Steve Harvey wasn't a host or a comic or a brand. He was just a man, standing in the blessing of being seen. The studio was quiet now. No music, no applause sign flashing overhead, no energy man hyping the crowd between takes. Just stillness, the kind that comes after something real has cracked the surface. Steve Harvey stood center stage, hands clasped in front of him, still trying to gather himself. His voice hadn't come back fully yet, but when he finally spoke, it was lower, more grounded. The tone of a man who wasn't performing, just reflecting. "You know," he said slowly, "this job, it's a blessing. But some days, it's heavy." The audience leaned in, hanging on to every word. You get on this stage, you crack jokes, you smile, you lift folks up, and sometimes you wonder if any of it sticks. If anybody sees the weight you carry behind the smile. His gaze drifted upward for a moment, like he was talking to something higher. "I've doubted myself," he admitted, "plenty of times. I've asked if I'm too old for this, if my time passed. I've wondered if all the years, all the grind, if it mattered." He looked back at the crowd, eyes still glassy. And then Clint Eastwood, shows up on a screen and tells me I'm a man worth watching. A soft wave of applause tried to rise, but Steve raised a hand gently to hold it back. "I needed that," he said quietly. "Not because I need praise, but because sometimes even strong men need to know they ain't invisible." He took a breath, deep and steady. The studio wasn't a set anymore. It was a sanctuary. "Aging ain't easy," he said. "You start thinking more about what you're leaving behind than where you're going. You start asking if your name means anything once the mic goes quiet." He paused, pressing a hand to his chest. "But today, I know I've left something behind that matters." A hush swept over the room like a blanket. No laughter now, just reverence. And Steve Harvey, usually the life of the party, stood there fully human, flawed, grateful, real. He smiled, small and raw. "I'm good now," he whispered. "I'm really good." Steve looked straight into the camera now, not for show, not for ratings, but like he was talking to someone he knew was on the other end of that lens. A brother, a father, a son. "Young men out there," he began, "I want you to listen to me. I don't care if you're 19 or 59. If Clint Eastwood, a man who's seen it all, can take time out of his life to lift up another man, so can you." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth made its own noise. We got this idea sometimes that real strength means staying quiet, toughing it out. But let me tell you something. Real strength is being able to look another man in the eye and say, "I see you, I respect you." The crowd nodded. Some clapped, soft and slow. Steve continued, "We don't give flowers until it's too late. We wait till the casket, till the tribute reel. But while a man's still breathing, while he's still fighting, still building, still showing up," he shook his head, "that's when it counts." He glanced out toward the audience, then back to the camera. "Call your brother, text your friend. Tell your pops you appreciate him. Lift each other up, not for likes, not for show, just because it's the right thing to do." A pause, a beat. Then he added, "You don't know who's watching. You don't know who's waiting to hear they matter. And sometimes that one word of respect, that might be the only thing holding a man together." The camera zoomed in just slightly, framing his face, his heart. "Let's stop waiting for permission to honor each other. We don't need a holiday to show up. We just need courage." He looked away for a second, then back again, eyes soft but certain. Be the reason another man stands taller. Be the reminder that he's seen. Be the voice that says, "You ain't alone." The audience stood, quietly, without instruction. And Steve? He didn't smile for the camera. He just nodded, as if to say, "That's all I ever wanted to leave behind." The studio was still quiet, that deep, respectful kind of quiet that comes when something honest has just been laid bare in front of the world. Not a word was spoken, not a cue card lifted, and yet, one by one, the audience began to rise. No shouting, no fanfare, just people standing up, because it felt like the only thing that made sense. Steve looked out at them, his people, his crowd, and for once, he didn't fill the space with a joke or a story. He just stood there, letting the weight of it all settle around him. A standing ovation wasn't rare for Steve Harvey. He'd had them before. But this one? This one wasn't for a punchline. It wasn't even for him, really. It was for the moment, for the truth, for the vulnerability, for the reminder that in a world full of noise, something real can still cut through. The applause wasn't loud. It was heartfelt, steady. Some folks clapping with tears in their eyes, others with their hands pressed to their chests like they'd just heard a sermon that cracked them wide open. Steve slowly stepped forward. The light softened just slightly around him. He looked out across the room, then back to the camera. And he said, quiet and low, like he was talking to someone sitting right beside him, "Man, that meant more than y'all know." No dramatic pause, no spin, just truth. The kind that hits you square in the soul. He gave one last nod. No catchphrase, no bow. Just a man, standing in a moment he didn't ask for, but would never forget. Soft music began to rise, gentle piano, almost like a lullaby for the spirit. The screen slowly faded to black. And then the words appeared in clean, quiet text. Dedicated to the men who show up, speak up, and lift others. No hashtags, no sponsors, no noise, just a reminder that in the right moment, a man can change another man's life with nothing more than his words. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.